The radar room was quiet. It shouldn't have been. In the bunker beneath Baghdad, dozens of Soviet-trained operators stared at green-tinted screens. P-18 surveillance radars swept the skies. Spoon rest arrays scanned overlapping corridors. Flat-face systems spun in perfect sync. The entire network, engineered across decades, had one purpose: to see what no enemy wanted seen. And yet, the screens were blank. No echoes, no clutter, no threats. Above them, in the clear desert sky, American F-117 sliced through the night, flying high, fast, straight toward command bunkers, communications hub, and hardened airfields. Inside each aircraft sat a pilot locked into a silent ballet of precision. No radio calls, no support aircraft, no jamming waves, just one weapon, one target, one flight path, and no one saw them coming. Bombs dropped. Explosions rippled across Baghdad. Power grids failed. Runways cracked. Radar stations collapsed. And in the bunker below, the radar screen still showed nothing. No missile tracks, no alerts, no aircraft, just static. In the hours that followed, Soviet advisors scrambled for explanations. They ordered signal analysis. They rechecked power supplies. They even accused operators of sleeping on duty. But it wasn't human error. It was something far worse. A fleet of stealth aircraft had passed through the densest Soviet air defense coverage without a single system detecting them. One advisor said what no one else dared: if this is true, then we are already blind. And in that moment, the Cold War's great defensive illusion cracked. The Soviets had believed that radar was their shield. But radar, it turned out, had limits. And the Americans had just flown through them for decades. Soviet engineers were confident they had built the most formidable air defense system on Earth. From the rolling hills of East Germany to the deserts of Iraq, a vast umbrella of radars, missiles, and interceptor aircraft formed a dense electronic cage. It was layered, redundant, and brutal, and at the heart of it all was radar. The Soviet assumption was simple: what the eye cannot see, radar can. From VHF to microwave bands, they developed an array of detection tools meant to catch anything with wings, no matter how high, fast, or small. By the late 1980s, this belief hardened into doctrine. Radar was absolute. Stealth was fantasy. Reports of American invisible planes were brushed off by senior officers as psychological warfare. At most, they assumed it was limited to lab experiments, fragile aircraft with no combat viability. After all, they reasoned, how could an aircraft carry bombs, fuel, and guidance systems yet still disappear from radar? The geometry didn't add up. The physics didn't cooperate, and most of all, the pride didn't allow it. Soviet radar designers like those at NII Radio Pribor and Almaz had engineered detection systems powerful enough to see tiny cross-sections at hundreds of kilometers. They tested against small targets, birds, even metallic balloons. They even theorized how to track low RCS drones using overlapping arrays and Doppler shifts. But they had never tested against the F-117. They didn't have access to its faceted design or radar-absorbent materials, or the extreme EM discipline of U.S. flight operations. They assumed a standard signal reflection, a predictable radar return, an aircraft that behaved like all others. The Americans weren't building for that. They were building for silence. The radar model inside Soviet doctrine was built on reflection, strength, and return angle. But the F-117 was shaped to reflect radar away, not back, to appear not as a contact, but as atmospheric noise, and that single assumption that everything that flies can be seen would unravel everything else. Because the night the F-117s entered Iraqi airspace, The Soviet systems detected exactly what they were designed to: a clean sky. Not because the radar was broken, but because the enemy had outgrown the spectrum. Soviet air defense doctrine wasn't built in a vacuum. It was born from bitter war, honed in real engagements, and refined through thousands of hours of simulation and export deployment. Layered defense was the law. Every hostile incursion would first be tracked by long-range early warning radars, massive VHF systems like the P-14 Tall King or P-18 Spoon Rest. Next came mid-range target acquisition radars, guiding interceptors like MiG-25s and MiG-23s to intercept vectors. And finally, close-in tracking radars would feed fire solutions to surface-to-air missile batteries SA-2s, SA-3s, and later SA-6s and SA-8s. The system was vast, it was lethal, and it had worked in Vietnam. Soviet SAMs and radar guidance had turned the skies into a graveyard for American phantoms. In the Yom Kippur War, Egyptian radar-guided missiles devastated Israeli formations, even in peacetime. NATO pilots knew Soviet radar could lock on at terrifying ranges. But this doctrine carried one fatal assumption: that targets could be tracked. Everything: the intercept chain, the missile logic. The engagement order depended on detection. If the radar saw nothing, the system did nothing. It was a machine of reaction, not anticipation. That was fine when aircraft reflected radar, but stealth made that impossible. In Soviet doctrine, stealth had never been taken seriously. Sure, there were early papers theorizing radar cross-section reduction. Some engineers proposed anti-radar coatings, curved design, or active cancellation. But these were niche pursuits, sidelined by a belief that brute radar power would win out. The Americans might get small, one colonel joked in a classified symposium. But they can't hide. That laughter stopped in 1991 because the F-117 didn't try to fight the radar. It made the radar irrelevant. Soviet doctrine had prepared for jamming, decoys, low-altitude intrusions, even swarm attacks. It had never prepared for invisibility. When the bombs began falling across Baghdad on hardened sites, on radar stations, on air defense nodes, there was no tracking, no warning, no intercept attempt, just impact. And by the time Soviet advisors realized what had happened, the doctrine they had built for 30 years had already been bypassed, not in theory, but in practice. Radar didn't fail. It had simply been left behind. December 20th, 1989. Operation Just Cause. Panama was not the Soviet Union's war, but Soviet radar technicians watched with interest. Embedded with Cuban and Panamanian units, they monitored the U.S. invasion with Soviet-supplied radar systems, early warning P-12s and spoon rest clones guarding air corridors near critical assets. And on the night of the first strike, something happened that didn't fit any pattern. One of the most secure compounds in Panama City, a military HQ believed untouchable, was hit with surgical precision. No alerts, no intercept attempts, no radar warnings. Only after-action reports revealed the attacker an F-117 Nighthawk. Soviet-trained technicians were stunned. The radar logs had recorded no spike, no Doppler anomaly, no frequency deviation, just silence. The aircraft had entered Panamanian airspace, flown across defended zones, dropped ordnance, and exited without a single radar lock. A few Soviet advisors suggested jamming. Others blamed terrain masking. But then came the satellite photos. The strike path had been direct. High altitude, over open terrain. There was no cover. There was no jamming. There was no countermeasure. Just a black triangle that slipped through radar as if it didn't exist. For Soviet command, it was easier to dismiss. Panama was too far from their control. The Americans might have used some experimental trick. Maybe the radar crews weren't alert. Maybe the logs were doctored. But a few engineers knew better. Inside the NII Radar Bureau in Moscow, a quiet note was circulated. If this event is true, we have no current system that can replicate detection. It was buried, ignored, because in Soviet theory, no aircraft could carry combat payloads, evade radar, and maintain strike capability all at once. The F-117 had just done all three, and it wouldn't be the last time. Because this event, this impossible strike, wasn't a fluke. It was a live demonstration. 2 years later, during Operation Desert Storm, the F-117 wouldn't hit just one target. It would hit dozens, and the Soviet-built radar net over Iraq, the pride of exported air defense, would be completely blind. In the days following the opening wave of Operation Desert Storm, Soviet radar analysts were inundated with reports from their advisors embedded with Iraqi air defense forces. Reports of devastation, of command bunkers flattened, of radar stations silenced, of airfields reduced to rubble, and in every single case, the attackers had not been seen, not once. The radar logs were damning: no spikes, no tracks, no approach vectors. The radar screens had simply remained green. F-117s had flown over Baghdad, hit strategic sites, and vanished undetected by every Soviet radar deployed in the country. For Soviet leadership, this wasn't a shock, it was heresy. At an emergency roundtable in Moscow, generals from the Voiska PVO Air Defense Forces, senior engineers from Almazante, and advisors to the Ministry of Defense reviewed the telemetry. They demanded alternative explanations. The Iraqis mishandled the systems. The radars were miscalibrated. There was jamming stealth as a myth. Denial came easy. Accepting that their best export radars had failed was politically impossible. To admit that billions of rubles invested in layered detection nets had been bypassed without resistance was to admit that Soviet radar supremacy was dead. But behind closed doors, the evidence piled up. Intercepted radio logs confirmed that Iraqi operators had never seen F-117s on screen. Radar recordings showed flat lines where engagement spikes should have been. Even the missile systems, SA-2s, SA-3s, SA-6s had never received lock commands. They were never given a chance to fire. More damning was the fact that none of the F-117s had been shot down. Not one, not even damaged. Soviet advisors who witnessed the strikes firsthand began filing reports with chilling conclusions. Targets were struck with no radar warning. Anti-air systems failed to engage. Aircraft untracked. No electronic countermeasures detected. No jamming, no spoofing, just nothing. Back in Moscow, a young radar analyst at NII Radio Pribor wrote what senior officers dared not say: our entire doctrine has been rendered theoretical. We have built radars that can see everything except the war we are now in. Still, the Kremlin maintained its public stance. The Americans were exaggerating. The Iraqis were incompetent. Stealth couldn't possibly work at scale. But inside the classified circles, the question could no longer be avoided. What if the Americans weren't bluffing? What if radar, the very spine of Soviet air defense, was now blind and the enemy was invisible? With the Iraqi radar net blinded and targets exploding across Baghdad, Soviet analysts needed answers fast. But truth wasn't the goal. Plausibility was. The first theory to gain traction within the Kremlin's military circles was electronic jamming. The Americans hadn't outsmarted radar. They argued they'd overwhelmed it. High-power ECM aircraft, airborne signal disruptors, and ground spoofing pulses. This, they claimed, explained the radar failures. It was a comforting idea. Because if jamming was the culprit, then radar still worked. It had simply been outnumbered, not outclassed. Official memos began circulating. The F-117's success is due to ECM cover. Targeting radars were saturated beyond tracking threshold. But then the intercept data arrived, radio logs pulled from Iraqi signals intelligence, synced with AWACS recon and post-strike telemetry, painted a different story. Dozens of F-117 sorties were flown without jamming support. No growlers, no compass call, no support birds orbiting the target zone. Just a single stealth aircraft, flying a lone path into the densest radar coverage in the Middle East, and back. More damning frequency analysis conducted by Soviet specialists embedded in Iraq showed no broadband noise, no false reflections, no traditional indicators of jamming. The radars weren't jammed. They were blind. Still, Moscow clung to the narrative. One general demanded to know if the Iraqis had activated the proper ECCM protocols. Another suggested their radar crews had panicked, switching frequencies too late. But the data remained uncooperative. In mission after mission, the pattern repeated. No signal spike, no track file, no engagement attempt, target destroyed. The jamming theory died the moment operators realized they hadn't been overwhelmed. They had seen nothing at all. An internal memo from Almaz R&D, restricted to First Directorate clearance, put it plainly, if this data is accurate. The F-117 requires no support. Its signature lies beneath the radar threshold. Engagement impossible. To the old guard, this was blasphemy. They had built their careers on the belief that radar could see everything. But the Americans hadn't used brute force. They had used absence. No emissions, no cross-section, no warning. The theory of jamming offered an excuse. Reality offered none. As the jamming explanation unraveled, Soviet analysts pivoted to another comforting hypothesis, terrain masking. Maybe the F-117s hadn't outwitted radar. Maybe they had simply flown so low, so close to the ground, that radar beams skimmed right over them. After all, low-flying attack profiles had always been a known vulnerability in radar architecture. The Earth's curvature, line-of-sight limitations, and signal deflection at low altitudes could all explain momentary blind spots. It was an elegant theory, and it made failure seem tactical, not systemic, but this theory died fast on the math alone. Post-strike forensic mapping from satellite data revealed the F-117s hadn't hugged the ground. They had flown at medium to high altitudes, 20,000 to 25,000 feet, well within detection range of Soviet-designed long-range radar like the P-18, which theoretically had coverage out to 240 kilometers against high-altitude targets. Even more damning. The flight paths had cut straight across the densest radar fields in Iraq. No terrain masking, no weaving through valleys, no exploiting gaps. Just a direct flight path into the heart of Baghdad and back. No evasion, just invisibility. Soviet advisors embedded with Iraqi units reviewed ground-based logs and ground observer data. The result, no visual sightings, no acoustic detection, and no radar contact despite full power and favorable atmospheric conditions. And this wasn't isolated. Across dozens of strike missions, the same impossibility repeated F-117s flying high, in open airspace, through active radar nets, and leaving no trace. Soviet scientists scrambled for models. Could weather anomalies play a role? Could electromagnetic interference from nearby jamming aircraft distort vertical beam tracking? But radar logs showed stable baselines. Weather was clear. Atmospheric conditions were optimal for signal propagation. One Iraqi colonel, trained in Moscow, finally admitted the unthinkable. We have full radar coverage. We have operators awake. We have power. and yet no detections. Either the F-117 does not exist, or we can no longer see the battlefield. In Moscow, the conclusion was devastating. The terrain masking theory had been comforting because it implied that radar still worked if only given better angles. But that illusion crumbled in every debrief, in every strike analysis, in every crater examined. The F-117s didn't sneak in low. They walked in the front door, and radar never blinked. For decades, Soviet intelligence had penetrated every layer of Western aerospace secrecy. They had stolen blueprints of the B-29 copied nuclear weapons design and infiltrated defense contractors from Los Angeles to Berlin. If a weapon flew, Moscow had seen it. But the F-117 was different. The Americans had hidden it so completely that for years, the Soviets weren't even sure it existed. First rumors emerged in the late 1970s, whispers of a black triangle flying out of Groom Lake. There were grainy satellite images of odd-shaped hangars, strange runway patterns, unusually high power consumption in remote desert bases, but no specs, no radar returns, no visual confirmations. Even after its public reveal in 1988, just 2 years before Desert Storm, the details were maddeningly vague. No internal layouts, no radar cross-section data, no flight performance metrics, no targeting algorithms, just a shape. Soviet engineers at Zhukovsky tried to model the designs. They analyzed the facets, guessed at the radar-absorbent coatings, speculated on engine masking techniques, but without emissions data, without flight telemetry, it was all theory. The GRU redoubled efforts. Recruitment targets were prioritized in Lockheed, Northrop, and the Air Force. Interception teams tried to pick up radar pings over test ranges. Electronic intelligence flights flew closer to Nevada, hoping to provoke a response. But the Americans never turned the radar on. F-117s flew in total EM silence. No IF, no radar sweeps, no broadcast pings. Even comms were minimized or encrypted beyond recognition. When Soviet satellites finally caught a glimpse of the aircraft during hangar maintenance, analysts were stunned. The geometry was pure radar deflection, flat surfaces angled to scatter waves away from the source, not back. One KGB analyst wrote, in a suppressed internal report, "If this design functions as theorized, our radar systems, regardless of power, cannot detect it in the frontal aspect." Still, they didn't believe it could work in combat. The belief was that stealth aircraft would be fragile, limited to short-range missions, vulnerable to visual acquisition or infrared lock-on. But then Desert Storm happened, and the F-117s flew deep, repeatedly, and without loss. In the aftermath, Soviet intelligence was tasked with recovering hard proof, survivability analysis, infrared tracking logs, signal reflections, black box data. They got nothing, because nothing had been recorded. The aircraft hadn't just evaded radar, it had evaded the entire Soviet intelligence ecosystem. Not because Moscow failed, but because the Americans had engineered a system that revealed nothing. No radar emissions, no heat spikes, no engine trails at high altitude, just a clean signature. Or rather, no signature at all. And in that silence, Soviet intelligence realized they hadn't been outspied, they had been outdesigned. What the Soviets never grasped until it was too late was that the F-117 wasn't just a stealth aircraft. It was the manifestation of a completely different approach to air war, a system where detection wasn't avoided. It was erased. The Americans hadn't simply added stealth to their toolkit. They had rewritten the entire equation. At the core of the system was the Lockheed F-117 Nighthawk, born under the ultra-secretive Skunk Works program. It was ugly, angular, unaerodynamic, a flying black wedge made of flat panels and radar-absorbent coatings. But every millimeter was deliberate. The shape scattered radar waves in useless directions. The engine intakes were buried and baffled. The exhaust was cooled and flattened to kill infrared trace. And most importantly, the jet never spoke. No radar pings, no data link chatter, no radio calls unless critical. F-117 missions were planned to atomic precision. Flight paths were calculated to minimize exposure to any radar lobe, using data pulled from national satellite imagery and real-time AWACS sweeps. Each route was not just about reaching the target, it was about never existing inside an enemy's detection matrix. But stealth was only one part. What truly made the system lethal was its self-contained autonomy. Unlike Soviet doctrine, which relied on ground-based radar, command relays, and overlapping defense zones, the F-117 operated independent of external vectors. It didn't need someone to tell it where to go or what to hit. It already knew. Precision navigation was powered by inertial guidance, fused with terrain contour mapping. Targeting was handled by a laser designator stabilized to fractions of a degree. Bombs were dropped from altitude with pinpoint accuracy, often striking within a meter of intended targets. Meanwhile, Soviet aircraft still needed mid-course corrections, still relied on radar to see, still required ground command to lock in coordinates. The Americans had removed every dependency that Soviet systems still needed to function, and most importantly, they trained for it. F-117 pilots were not just pilots, they were stealth operators. Drilled in EM discipline, terrain flight, radio silence, and abort conditions. They learned how to fly solo, how to trust the system, and how to disappear without panic. The U.S. didn't build a better fighter. They built a better war, where radar had no meaning, where interceptors had no chance, where missiles never saw their prey, where the only sign of the attacker was the explosion on the ground. One Soviet analyst, reviewing post-war satellite imagery of Baghdad, finally wrote, "They do not fight for air superiority. They begin with it because the true American system wasn't about surviving enemy detection. It was about making enemy detection irrelevant. And once that system was unleashed, no Soviet doctrine could stop it." Operation Desert Storm was supposed to be a proving ground for Soviet-built defenses. Iraq had one of the most layered air defense networks outside the Soviet Union, P-18 radars, SA-2s, SA-3s, SA-6s, even the more advanced SA-8s. Soviet advisors had spent years training Iraqi crews. The expectations that Baghdad would be an iron dome. Instead, it became a graveyard of illusions. On January 17, 1991, the air war began. In its opening salvo, over 40 F-117 sorties struck key Iraqi targets, command bunkers, radar sites, SAM control centers. Every single aircraft flew through active Soviet-designed radar zones, engaged precision targets, and returned untouched. Not one was detected. Not one was tracked. Not one was fired upon. As bombs exploded with uncanny precision, Soviet-trained radar crews were screaming at dead consoles. Blips never appeared. Lock tones never triggered. Missile batteries never received launch orders because there was nothing to lock onto. It was not a battle. It was a vanishing act. By the end of the first night, the United States had neutralized the top-tier radar and SAM command infrastructure of Iraq, the very nervous system of the air defense grid. And they did it without alerting the enemy until the bombs had already landed. Soviet advisors on the ground were left stunned. Their technology, once feared across the globe, had not simply been defeated, it had been ignored. The humiliation deepened over the next 30 days. The F-117 flew over 1,300 combat sorties. struck hundreds of hardened targets, and not one was shot down. Not one even took damage. It was the highest survivability rate of any aircraft in the war. Meanwhile, Soviet radar crews were launching SAMs blind, based on visual spotting or audio cues. They were firing missiles at ghosts, hitting nothing. Intercept missions were scrambled, but the Iraqi MiGs were chasing phantoms. By the time they reached an area, the F-117 was already gone. Soviet engineers watching the footage from Baghdad felt disbelief melt into despair. One wrote in a classified internal memo, "We trained for war." They arrived from science fiction. The humiliation wasn't just technical. It was ideological for decades. Soviet doctrine had promised that with enough radar, enough missiles, enough interception zones, no American aircraft could survive a contested airspace. The F-117 didn't just survive. It walked in, destroyed the airspace itself, and walked out untouched. Baghdad had been the showcase of Soviet radar dominance. Now it was its obituary. The collapse didn't happen with a headline or a single admission. It happened quietly inside secure Soviet defense circles, in redacted reports, in hushed conversations among engineers who had once boasted that nothing could pierce their radar nets. But after Desert Storm, the truth was unavoidable. Their entire vision of modern air warfare had been rendered obsolete. Soviet radar. Once the crown jewel of the PVO air defense system had failed its ultimate test, not because it was poorly built, but because the enemy had changed the rules. The F-117 proved that radar detection could no longer be trusted as the cornerstone of air defense. It wasn't a matter of power or calibration. It was a matter of physics, and the Americans had weaponized those laws first. What made it worse was that Soviet doctrine had no replacement. Their entire strategy layered detection, vectoring interceptors. SAM integration was built on the assumption that hostile aircraft would always produce trackable signals, but stealth didn't reduce those signals. It erased them. This wasn't a defeat by superior numbers or better-trained crews. It was a paradigm shift. The MiG pilots, trained to fly under GCI direction, couldn't engage what radar never saw. The SAM crews, trained to respond to lock alerts, received none. The command bunkers coordinating integrated defense had no idea they were under attack until the lights went out. And across the Warsaw Pact, the aftershocks were instant. Countries that had purchased Soviet radar and SAM systems began to question their effectiveness. Eastern European military planners sought back-channel access to NATO air defense protocols. Even Soviet-aligned nations in the Middle East began demanding answers. How had invisible jets flown straight through Soviet radar grids back in Moscow? The ideological damage was even deeper. The USSR had spent decades projecting that its science and engineering were equal to, if not better than, the West's. They had claimed they could counter any American weapon with volume, resilience, and simplicity. But stealth wasn't just an American weapon. It was a form of disappearance. Soviet doctrine had been built for visibility. The Americans had built for ghosts. And the final collapse came when even the most loyal officers admitted that no existing radar, no planned upgrade, and no doctrine in place could adapt in time. One senior general, in a classified Voiska PVO session, spoke words that echoed like a funeral bell. "We are defending a sky that no longer exists." The Cold War was won by many systems, but few delivered a message as final, as undeniable, as the F-117. It didn't shoot down enemies. It didn't dogfight. It didn't even appear on the screen. It simply arrived unseen, struck, and vanished. And in that silence, it buried a generation of radar scientists, doctrines, and belief systems. Today, Stealth is no longer myth, it is assumption. The legacy of the F-117 lives in every low observable design, in every VLO airframe deployed across U.S. operations. But for the Soviet Radar Command, its legacy is something darker, a shadow they could never lock onto. The radar arrays are still there on old Iraqi airfields, in rusting Soviet bunkers, in museum corners behind glass. Their systems, once hailed as unbreachable, now artifacts of a vanished era. No one in Moscow made a grand admission, but the retreat was total. Research pivoted to passive sensors. New programs explored VHF and over-the-horizon detection. Funding was quietly redirected toward stealth countermeasure experiments. But the damage had been done not in 1991, but the moment radar failed to see. The ghost of the F-117 haunted every Soviet system, not because it defeated them in combat, but because it showed up in the one place they were told was impossible inside their shield, undetected. One radar officer, long retired, said it best the Americans never came through the door. They were already in the room. And that is the final truth of the stealth era. Power didn't come from firepower. It came from disappearance. The Soviets had built walls. The Americans simply walked through them.